Hey everyone, welcome to the Drive Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Attia. This podcast, my website, and my weekly newsletter all focus on the goal of translating the science of longevity into something accessible for everyone. Our goal is to provide the best content in health and wellness, full stop, and we've assembled a great team of analysts to make this happen. If you enjoy this podcast, we've created a membership program that brings you far more in-depth content if you want to take your knowledge of this space to the next level. At the end of this episode, I'll explain what those benefits are, or if you want to learn more now, head over to peterattiamd.com/subscribe. Now, without further delay, here's today's episode. Welcome to a special episode of The Drive. To celebrate our 100th anniversary, we have decided to try something a little different. The title of this episode is Strong Convictions Loosely Held. And what that basically comes down to is Bob asking me questions about things that I've kind of changed my mind on over the past year and a half. So we definitely go into a lot of areas where I had a strong point of view or a reasonable point of view on something, and then after either preparing for a podcast or going through a discussion, I sort of came away with a different point of view, and it's, usually changed my behavior for the better. So we thought this would be kind of an interesting and maybe even clever way to go about doing a retrospective on the first 99 episodes. And of course, we also do take a moment to sort of talk about some of the highlights, things that I've maybe enjoyed the most or that Bob's enjoyed the most. If you like the style of this episode, by the way, please let us know, because I'd be open to doing it again. I actually found it quite fun to reminisce. So again, if you find this interesting, please let us know. I'd be happy to repeat this every 50 episodes or so. And I guess without any further delay, I hope you enjoy episode 100 of The Drive. So for episode 100, as I alluded to in the introduction, we're going to do something a little bit different. And I can't take any credit for this idea. So if you like it, Bob gets all the credit. If you dislike it, well, hopefully you won't dislike it. But many of you know Bob Kaplan, the guy behind the guy behind the guy. And one of the things that Bob has had the luxury of doing, if you can think of it as a luxury, is sort of helping me get ready for many of the past 99 episodes of podcasts. And there's a lot that goes into making this sausage known as the podcast. Once in a while, I just get up there and wing it. But I think more often than not, a lot of thought has to go into who do we want to interview? What do we want to talk about? What do I need to know in order to have this discussion in sort of a thoughtful way? And throughout that process, my opinion on things can change. And sometimes not necessarily through the podcast per se, but just through the evolution of learning and what it means to sort of scour information and test a hypothesis and see data that conflict with your pre-existing way of thinking about things. I mean, all of these things have led to an enormous evolution over a period of time in the way I think about things and do a lot of things. And I know that on some levels that might sound like a real cop-out to think that one can change their mind on how things work. But I think that when I've written this before, I think in politics that may be a cop-out, but I don't think in science or in medicine that should be viewed as a cop-out. I think one should always be malleable and willing to sort of lean into new information. And in fact, the title of this podcast, Strong Convictions Loosely Held, is a phrase that exists in various different forms. So sometimes it's strong opinions loosely held, strong opinions weakly held, strong convictions weakly held. I've seen many different versions of it, but in particular, this version of it, strong convictions loosely held, is something that I remember one of my patients telling me a couple of years ago in reference to one of his mentors in the investment space. So this patient of mine is himself an investor, and he came out of a very successful hedge fund, and he spoke very affectionately about how he was mentored there. And he said that that was sort of one of the things that allowed them to be so successful was they had very strong convictions and they would make bold investments based on those things, but they were very loosely held convictions and they were always looking for ways to change their information. So in that spirit, I am joined today by Bob Kaplan, and I think Bob has along with maybe 2 or 3 other people around me clinically, as good an insight into some of the various things I've changed my mind on. And so, Bob, how do you want to do this? Do you want to just ask me about things I've changed my mind on, or point them out to me, or call me?
Yeah, I think that works. Call you out on the things you've changed your mind. But again, I think it's really important. That's a feature, not a bug. One of the quotes that I heard, or somebody talking about this idea of the strong opinions weakly held, is, it was on a blog actually, and it's Richard Feynman, just to confuse everyone. Richard Feynman, the SUNY biochemist, who said that a colleague at NIH said...
And by the way, that's SUNY, S-U-N-Y.
Just to confuse people even more.
Just to really confuse people now. It's not the Shia Richard Feynman. It's, forget it.
Yes. So he had a colleague, at least he wrote this in his blog, and he said, what you do in science is you make a hypothesis, and then you try to shoot yourself down. And I think that that's really succinct. And the podcast, for over the 100 episodes, Peter has a lot of hypotheses, which is great for me because I think I share a lot of those and I get to dig into them as an analyst. And so I think from a selfish perspective, what I see in the podcast and the episodes and why Peter's so successful, other than his rugged good looks, is that he has a lot of hypotheses, he has a lot of ideas, and he's not afraid to just say whatever he thinks and try to find the people who are the absolute experts, or even just somebody who disagrees with him and his take on something. Try to dig into it further to see if he can shoot it down, because I think the more hypotheses you can shoot down, actually things get a little bit simpler, even as much as we're waiting in a lot of this uncertainty.
But, a lot of that actually occurs behind the scenes. I hear what you're saying, but I think most of the shooting down is not actually done in the podcast. It's actually done in the preparation for it and some of the analyses that come after the fact. So I also could imagine somebody listening to this saying, well, your podcasts aren't really that contentious. It's not like you're getting into rip-roaring fights. It's not like our podcast is sort of an environment where we're always just trying to come up with a contrarian point of view or an antagonistic point of view. I think a lot of the places where my minds have been changed has been in getting ready to do it. So, and sometimes, frankly, it just doesn't have to do with the podcast, but I do think this is a great excuse as any to be 100 episodes into this thing and say, hey, 2 years ago, what did I do, or what did I think, or how did I behave in a way that was different from today? So yeah, hopefully we've got some interesting ones to talk about. I've seen that you and Nick have been comparing notes.
We have. I've got a good mixture here of hard topics and maybe a little softer. So we'll see if we can sprinkle them in. This might be on the harder side. Metformin. So maybe think about, I guess in the context of the episodes, it was summer of, was it 2018 or so, you started the podcast. Since then, how have your strong convictions, if you had them, changed at all since then?
Well, in the summer of 2018, I was taking metformin. I had been taking it for about 7 years. I think I started in 2011, and that was based on a lot of research that I had seen and read, and a white paper we had written internally that looked at the benefits of metformin in people with type 2 diabetes and in people without type 2 diabetes, but with obesity, which was probably just a proxy for hyperinsulinemia, but it's not entirely clear. But the benefits were not subtle. In particular, the benefits were around a reduction in cancer mortality and survival with cancer as well. So both a reduction in the incidence of cancer and an increase in the survival of cancer. And we certainly weren't the only people to figure this out in 2011. There are people who figured this out long before us, but we were sort of, I think, a little bit early on the cusp of viewing metformin as a drug that might have a benefit for people who were not type 2 diabetic, but looking for sort of a boost in longevity. And truthfully, not a lot of our patients in the practice were taking metformin, one, because my convictions, I guess, weren't that strong. They were strong enough that I was willing to take it because I could also kind of monitor a bunch of things in the background, but not strong enough that I felt like it should be dispensed like you would dispense Chiclets or Tic Tacs to people. I don't know why I said Chiclets or...
Because you dispense them like candy anywhere you go. We know you're the Chiclets and Tic Tacs guy. Whenever
I don't know the last time I had a Chiclet or a Tic Tac. Do they even make Chiclets anymore?
I think they do.
I don't even remember seeing these things in a grocery store. And
I know they make
I've seen
Tacs.
Tic Tacs, but I don't think I've seen a chiclet in a long time. I miss chiclets. So that said, a lot of patients over time would say, hey, I've heard about this drug called Metformin, kind of interested in it. What's your take on it? And sort of share our white paper with them. And, in the end, we ended up prescribing it for a number of patients. I would say off-label, meaning these aren't patients that were hyperinsulinemic or diabetic. So fast forward, well, actually, we had an interview with Nir Barzilai, who is certainly one of the world's experts on this topic. That was a very interesting podcast. I learned a few things there that I didn't even know before, which, again, given that I'd been spending so much time thinking about metformin, I think that really speaks to Nir's depth of knowledge on that front. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And the first clue was December of 2018. So in December of 2018, which was when I first became interested in Zone 2 training, it was the first time I'd ever been checking my lactate levels under low levels of exertion. And it was the first time I'd been just checking lactate levels in a while, since I hadn't been doing much lactate testing since I stopped competing in sports where that mattered. And I was kind of surprised at how high my lactate levels were, especially my fasting lactate, just baseline, like not exercising lactate levels. And that got me poking and coming to the obvious conclusion that metformin is a weak mitochondrial toxin. And as such, it probably shouldn't be surprising that you'd have a higher level of lactate. In medical school, every student learns that one of the potential rare complications of metformin is lactic acidosis. I'm sure somebody in an ER somewhere has even seen it. So again, it's not a huge stretch that you would see elevated levels of lactate, but it did get me thinking, which is, wait a minute, what if the benefits of metformin are only going to be most pronounced in people who have otherwise quite defective mitochondria to begin with, and or people who can tolerate a slight hit in the sort of mitochondrial performance because of all the other benefits they're getting? And what if that doesn't hold true for someone who's otherwise quite healthy and looking to really maximize mitochondrial health and throughput? And basically, since that time, I would say that more and more literature have probably emerged suggesting that we might want to think about metformin different in people who are quote unquote sick versus healthy. I hate using a stupid division like that, sick versus healthy, but I mean, I could sort of explain what I mean in a bit more detail, but I think people get the gist of it. What if this is a drug that still offers a sizable benefit to people who are metabolically ill, but that benefit sort of evaporates in people who are not? And so I would say that my position today, so I've stopped taking metformin. After making this observation in December of 2018, I then spent the next 6 months, maybe not that long, maybe the next 4 months, experimenting a lot with it. So only dosing it in the evening, but not in the morning, reducing the dose, like making a whole bunch of changes to see if I noticed any difference before ultimately stopping it. And then stopping it altogether and then realizing a couple of things. One, yeah, my lactate levels went down and my zone 2 efficiency as measured by lactate went up. But also my glucose levels are a bit higher. There's no question it was suppressing glucose levels, and that was probably a good thing. So I have no way of knowing if the net benefit of stopping metformin has been positive or negative, but I now would say I reserve metformin prescriptions for patients who obviously are in need of it from the standpoint of glucose and insulin regulation, but I don't view it really as a pro-longevity agent yet. Again, very likely we'll be having a discussion in 2 years, Bob, and I'll have changed my view again. There will be some new data that will have emerged that will have told me that, yes, despite the elevated levels of lactate, it's still a net positive, even in someone who's metabolically healthy. And we've obviously looked at a bunch of other papers that look at the impact of metformin on muscle mass and training effects, though a lot of those studies seem suboptimal because they don't include some of the more functional analyses of the muscle that you'd want to see. So I don't think this is not an open and shut case. We have a lot to continue to learn, but as of today, I have a really different point of view than for the previous decade.
And I don't think the jury's necessarily out that in the next 900 episodes that you do going forward, you'll probably have a few that are on metformin, and you may change your thinking on it down the road, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I think one big thing that's going to be interesting is to see if TAME, which is the study that Nir Barzilai spoke about on our podcast, does TAME actually get funded? Because again, if TAME is done correctly, it's really not going to be weighted towards people with diabetes. It's going to be looking at people without diabetes and asking the question, can this extend life indirectly via mitigating the onset of chronic disease? So in the end, nothing matters more than that, is health span and lifespan. All of these other things that we're looking at, such as lactate levels and zone 2 efficiency or muscle mass, those are proxies for that. So in a large enough study, if we could actually go after the thing that matters, that would hold great weight.
Okay, so I'm going to bring in a little social media into this. On Instagram, I think it's pretty clear that anybody who follows you, that you recently got a dog. You're snuggling up with that pup. And along the same lines, have you changed your mind on having a dog? Because I believe in some of the podcasts, maybe we've talked about in the AMAs and other times about the reluctance to get a dog, and maybe you caving at some point down the road.
Yes, we do have a puppy. 4 weeks ago, we got her, little Molly. And you are absolutely correct that, remember that scene in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles when I think it was John Candy's character says something to the effect of, if I'd woken up with my head sewn in the carpet, I would have been less surprised. Remember that line? I thought the day that we were going to get a dog was never. I just thought it'll never happen because I don't have the bandwidth to absorb any additional work. My wife is already functioning at the level of 3 wives. And it's just like, why would we do that to ourselves? And even though our daughter was the one begging, it's not like she can take care of a dog when she's at school or whatever. So I was just like, no, this is never going to happen. And then I don't know I just don't know what happened, for lack of a better way of describing it. Somewhere in there, the resistance just weakened. And I was in Australia, and I must admit, prior to that Australia trip, we had gone and looked at a couple of puppies in a dog shelter nearby. And I must admit, there were some cute little puppies in there. But I still kind of came away from that experience thinking, we just need a couple more years. We just need the 2 guys to be a little bit older and a little less dependent on us. And then somehow they just went to the dog shelter when I was in Australia. They FaceTimed me from there and said, there's this little girl, little puppy, Molly. She's perfect. And they gave me all the reasons why she was perfect. And I actually went out to social media to seek an opinion. This was like one of the few times social media was actually helpful, because this puppy was the runt of her litter and she was visually impaired. And I really wanted to know if we were biting off more than we could chew. And so I asked that question broadly, and the feedback was overwhelming, actually, both on Twitter and Instagram. And people said, she's going to make an awesome puppy. And I will say this, a month in, it's way more work than I expected. And not so much for me, but certainly for my wife and for my daughter and for me too. But I'm taking on 10% of the additional work. But I think people were right that a dog that doesn't see perfectly, perhaps coupled with some other characteristics of just being a rescued dog, she's amazingly gentle and sweet and kind. And I don't know. So I don't regret it, even though it's harder than I thought it would be. And there have been a number of accidents that have required significant cleaning. But I think I'm getting the point that people had been trying to make for years when I had been saying, why would anybody get a dog? Which is, I think there are these intangible benefits that come from a dog that you don't appreciate if you try to just think about it with your logical brain. You guys have a dog, right?
We do. The dog is passed. We're going to get another one. But yeah, I mean, I definitely share your feelings about it. It's funny. It sounds a lot like having a kid, where you think you get older. I think if you don't pop one out when you're younger and you're older, you're trying to think of like, when's the right time? We need to line up all these things. It's just like, there's never the right time. Although probably any time is probably the right time if you don't have a kid and then you raise that child. And there are probably accidents along the way as well, whether it's a dog or a person. This is completely inappropriate, but I thought of it when you were talking about loving a dog. This is a joke. This is not my joke. It says, want to know who loves you more, Put your spouse and your dog in the trunk of a car and drive around for an hour. When you open the trunk, who's happy to see you? I think like that joke, I don't know, I'd heard it recently, but I would always be amazed that you just think of like dogs and you come home every single day and it's like you went to Afghanistan, a tour of duty for 3 years and you came back and you get that kind of reaction every single day. And it's pretty amazing. I'm a big fan. So I have a...
So I'm in the club now.
Yeah, I'm in the club. It was interesting too. I caught one thing which is great is that when people ask you, where does Peter Attia get his second opinions? You can say Twitter and Instagram. It's just a nice thing.
When it really counts.
We're going to go back to the pharmaceuticals. We've got Rapamycin. How have your feelings changed on this one?
Well, this has sort of been another area of real interest of mine for many years. Not quite as far back as the sort of metformin interest, which started, I think, around 2010, 2011 for me, but probably by about 2012, and certainly by about 2014, when the first, that sort of really interesting everolimus paper was published by Joan Manick, Lloyd Klickstein, and others in December of 2014. That was a real peak to my curiosity. That was a paper that showed that the strength of vaccination in healthy subjects who were, I believe, about age 65 could be augmented by basically a rapamycin analog, which again is counterintuitive, right? That's the adaptive immune system getting better with rapamycin. Very counterintuitive because, of course, rapamycin's on-label use is specifically to suppress the adaptive immune system, and that's what makes it such a efficacious tool for mitigating organ rejection. But of course, what that study would show was a couple of things, which is there are different ways that you can dose it. 2 of the 3 treatment arms in that study were only being given rapamycin once a week, one at 5 milligrams, one at 20 milligrams. By the way, I said rapamycin. I almost use everolimus and rapamycin interchangeably, but it was not rapamycin. And that study was sort of the turning point for me. And what it really led to was the next 4 years, just a deeper and deeper look into all of the literature. We've had, I think, 2 podcasts that have been dedicated to rapamycin and mTOR, one with David Sabatini, one with Matt Caberline. I feel like we're overdue for another one, by the way, because I know those were very early.
A little inside baseball, but those interviews were, I think, like in 2017.
That's right.
That was at Sabatini, and it was this summer. We went over there. You gave a talk.
That's right. Yeah.
Talked to some autophagy geeks.
Yep, August of 17. So we're way overdue to go back and revisit that. But basically just more and more data, both in animals and in humans, really got me to a point where I felt really comfortable that, one, I was taking enough, because you've probably heard me talk about this before, that you always think of 2 risks when you're taking a medication that you don't have an immediate biomarker for. So if you're talking about taking a statin or taking a PCSK9 inhibitor, well, you have a very clear biomarker that at least tells you if the drug is working. And similarly, you have either clinical signs or biomarkers that tell you if things are going awry. Clinical signs might be, muscle aches, and you might see, outside of complete breakdown of muscle, you might still see significant elevations of CK or significant elevations of liver function tests or things like that. You have some sort of bearing on either symptoms that would cause you to revisit your decision to use the medication, or lack of efficacy, or other signs that tell you, hey, this isn't a good idea. But with rapamycin, you don't have any of that. I mean, on the symptom side, obviously, if you take too much, you're going to start to see some of the symptoms like mouth sores and things like that. But you don't really know if you're taking enough, and you don't know if you're taking too much beyond some of those symptoms. And so you really have to be able to triangulate on what the right dose is. And so that's what basically took me about 4 years. Once I sort of felt like, I think this makes sense, there was still, I couldn't quite get to the point where I could understand what to do, how to do it. And I think that was sort of the big switch that flipped in, well, probably about 18 months ago, kind of in the fall of 2018. And I would still say that here I am a year and a half later, I'm still really eager to figure out ways that we can have biomarkers that can lend some insight into this. Probably more so on the efficacy side. There's still a lot of questions I have on the use of rapamycin, even though I'm using it. I sort of cycle it a little bit. I think there's lots to be asked there. Is it the right cycling? Is it the right period? Is the right on versus off? All of those things we don't have enough answers yet. But my convictions are now high enough on the side of something that looks like what I'm doing right now is probably beneficial.
One thing interesting too, just about the metformin and rapamycin is, I think you might have talked about this with Nir. That was like January of last year, so about a year ago, is him and a few other colleagues. I think Steve Ostad was one of them. They were talking about what is the trial that we want to do. And I think there was a lot of debate and healthy conversation around whether they should use metformin or rapamycin. And I wish that there was enough resources in the world to try both. But it sounded like they had to do one, and it was metformin.
Yeah, I remember actually having that discussion with Steve Ostad over dinner about 4 years ago. At the time, before TAME had been fully formulated, and saying, if you're only going to get one bite at this apple, rapamycin might be the more interesting agent to study. I think their concern was the monitoring was going to be more complicated. Just the economics of trying to understand how the immune system was potentially changing was going to make that sort of a cost-prohibitive study, unfortunately.
On the subject of apples, I don't know why this is apples. I think of archery and shooting an apple on someone's head. But are you still practicing archery?
I am. I practice a lot. I think archery and driving are the two things that I really sort of just try to carve out time for every single day that I'm not traveling. Luckily, I travel a lot less than I used to, so that means more practice.
How do you think that goes? I was just thinking that in terms of getting better, the more you practice it, do the gains become more and more incremental, or do you always feel like you're learning something each session, so to speak? And I mean, just in terms of archery, I think it's more objective, where maybe you can take your score and say, on average, I'm improving over time with those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both so different and yet so similar. I think that with archery, it's so hard to explain how addictive it is if you've never done it. But I think anybody who's fired a compound bow, I think most people are like, oh, wow, I can see why this is really something else. First of all, there's no ceiling to how much one can improve. That's the beauty of something like this, is you have so much ability to measure how you're doing that you can never say, I've kind of plateaued, I've kind of hit my limit. Like, there's just always a place to go up. And really, it's many different sports in one. There's the indoor target, you're shooting at 20 yards. And at 20 yards, you're expected to be able to hit something the size of a quarter. So if you think about that, something 60 feet away, you have to be able to hit a quarter 60 feet away. And in a perfect round, you would take 60 shots and do that 60 times. How many times do you think I've done that so far, Bob?
100.
0.
See what I did there?
Very nice. Very nice. Yes, the 100th episode. No. So I have yet to score a perfect 300 round, like a perfect 360 round, which is what that would be. So anyway, it's meaning all 60 were in the tiny little X. And to be clear, there are days when I find that fact infuriating. Like, there's times when I get so close and then I blow it at the end. And then there's times I just blow it in the first shot and I'm like frustrated and I don't even want to finish. But you also realize that archery is kind of a great metaphor for life. And you can't focus just too much on your target. You really have to focus on the process or you're not going to get better. So one of the things we do a lot in archery is called blank bailing, which is taking a shot at a huge target, like they're these big bales, without actually looking at a target, like literally not having a target there. So there's nothing for you to fixate onto, so that you can just go through the sequence. And when I'm traveling, I take this thing called a shot trainer with me, which is like a little string attached to something that sits in your hand that sort of mimics the feeling of the riser. And I'll take maybe 20 to 40 shots a day in my room, hotel room or whatever, that are obviously not aimed at a target or not doing anything, but just going through the muscle memory of where are my feet, where is the pressure on my hands, how am I feeling the contraction of my rhomboid, all those sorts of things. Again, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh my God, how did that guy just manage to waste the last 3 minutes of my life telling me that? Again, I don't think you have to like archery to appreciate the notion of mastery. And I do think that as people, we sort of crave getting better at something. And that can be lots of things. It doesn't just have to be sort of a physical domain. It can be an intellectual domain. It can be an emotional domain or a relational domain. But anyway, for me, this habit with archery, this curiosity started 3 years ago. And now it's something I can't imagine. If a day goes by that I don't do it, I feel like I'm missing something.
I think there's something to that process. I mean, I think about my childhood, the intellectual pursuit. I had these things uncoupled that I just wasn't very good. I was not a very good student. 1.44 grade point average in high school.
What?
Don't fire me.
What?
Don't.
How is that?
That's actually
possible?
really hard to graduate with that kind of GPA.
It's not even hard to graduate. How do you even get a grade point average of 1.44?
The secret is not showing up. That's how you do that.
What were you doing?
Having fun. At least what I thought was having fun at the time. But I was also, I guess, to the larger point here, not get into my childhood too much.
Wait a minute. You can't throw out the 1.44 without explaining it, but okay.
Yeah. I was also playing hockey, and that's a totally different sport, but I excelled at it. And I went through you don't automatically excel at a sport like that. Probably particularly in Massachusetts, you got to really work at it. And it instilled a lot of stuff in me. And I never made the connection until later in my life that intellectual pursuits and educating yourself and things like that, it's not very much different. It's like, in order to be good at blank, you are going to suck at blank. If you have a few of these victories, Peter, you have so many of these things. I think you're, in a way, obsessed with mastery, and you have so many different things that you've pursued excellence in, that you realize, even if you have no idea what this thing is, if you put the time and the effort in, that you can get better at it. And so I would put a plug in for anybody at a younger age. Maybe it's I never thought about musical instruments that way, but maybe it is. I know Olivia plays the drums, and that's something you first start and you're just you can't keep a beat. And then check in a few months later and you can see that progress. And you just know that work and effort and time, I mean, this sounds like grit, those kinds of things, but they apply to so many different things. And just with this podcast I think there's a parallel there with all the episodes and all the information that goes into the prep with the guests. And I think that you have a predilection to guests who have a healthy obsession, let's call it healthy, a healthy obsession with these topics as well. And they know a lot about these things, probably through similar practice with those things.
It's funny you bring that up, by the way. I actually had this discussion with Olivia 2 days ago. And I don't know why. Oh, I know how it came up. We were sitting there at dinner and I was just sort of complimenting her on how impressed I was with how hard she's been studying this year, which was a real switch that flipped in her. And it's you don't have to ask her to do her homework. She just wants to do it. And she makes cue cards and is always just going out of her way to really try to learn stuff in a way that I just didn't see her doing before. And so I was just saying, hey, that's so great, blah, blah, blah. And then she sort of asked me, she's like, well, when you were my age, how much did you study? And I was like, Olivia, you have no idea. You couldn't have done less than I did. I was categorically a moron in school. Again, there's a fine line there. And really what it was I wasn't interested in what was happening. And so my interests were elsewhere. But the point I made to her is exactly the point that you made, which was the reason that I was ultimately able to do well in school was fortunately I had spent all of that time still trying to master something. And it was that sort of pursuit of that became transferable. And so I agree. I just think I do pity the person who's never found it interesting to try to get better at something. And to be clear, you can take it too far. I don't consider archery for me to be the greatest form of recreation because I am very internally competitive and I'm sometimes too focused on the result and not the process. So there are days when archery is like meditation to me. Just being out there just feels so amazing and the sun is shining and the wind is blowing and I can sort of disregard the outcome, but that's not often the case. And so when you think about the podcast with Ryan Holiday, where we talk about stillness, I would say that archery for me does not constitute stillness, because stillness can't really have an objective. And I think for me, archery carries with it too much of an objective. So I still think that one has to have those other things in there. This is sort of funny. I didn't even think of it this way, but I think this is one thing I've noticed about having a puppy, frankly. A puppy is, as kinetic as she is, it is kind of a form of stillness for me. Like taking her out and walking her and picking up her poop, there's nothing else to be doing, and there's no outcome associated with it. There's no objective. It's literally just a forced reason to be outside and to be observing the completely comical nature of a puppy. So, yeah, I think it's funny, even though we didn't pose it this way, if you want to ask me about another really big change in the way I think about things over the past couple of years, it's a huge appreciation for how essential it is to have something that is not object-oriented, outcome-based in your life. Like, not everything in your life can be outcome-based. I've recently gone back to swimming, actually.
This might be a good segue to another topic, but it's funny when you were talking about stillness and how some of these little things that you don't even realize are stillness or stillness. I was going to use the example of washing dishes, and then I realized you've got the forks and spoons and knives game, so you turned that into a competition.
Even
though a lot of
dishes,
people just wash the dishes and it's like it's therapeutic for them.
Lost its stillness for them. Yeah.
But you turned it into a competition.
But things that were once, like, I was saying a second ago, I mean, even swimming for me now is something that is really a form of stillness. So I just started swimming again a couple months ago, and I go like once a week, and I don't keep track of how far I'm swimming. I know I'm not swimming too far. I'm in the water maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and all I'm doing is swimming. I'm not doing workouts. I'm not looking at the pace clock. I'm not doing intervals. I literally just get in the water with no agenda other than to get wet and hear the sound of water going by my ears. Probably I'm not even swimming hard enough to get into zone 2, truthfully. I doubt my heart rate's above 120.
That's the next topic.
Yeah.
That's where I think this is a good segue. I
All
think
right,
this is
very
apropos.
well.
If you think about it, you can talk about it, but I think that's one of the things is like a governor putting a rate limiter on your performance when you do zone 2. That it's almost like, for a lot of people, it is. For me, doing this reminds me kind of stillness, although I might read on the bike or things like that. But can you talk about zone 2 importance and how your thinking has changed on that?
Yeah. When I stopped riding a bike with a purpose, which was for me a time trial, so that would have been late 2014, early 2015, I kind of really just stopped doing any low intensity aerobic training. So anyone who does ride a bike or swims a lot has plenty of that activity in them. So even if you're training for the 200-meter individual medley, which is a race that's very short, very quick, and very painful, you still put in hours and hours a week of aerobic-based training. Similarly, if you're training for a 1-hour all-out time trial, you still put in hours a week of low-end aerobic-based training. But when I stopped doing that, I was like, well, I don't need to do this anymore. And I went from cycling to rowing and running. And I was sort of obsessed with just being as efficient as possible. So everything was all out. I mean, if I was running, it was going to be a 6-minute mile. It wasn't going to be a 9-minute mile. I think, especially through the interactions that I had with Inigo, who I met about a year before I had him on the podcast, which was just recently, it was sort of meeting him and kind of going back through the literature on that type of training and the benefits that it could have, both from the standpoint of metabolic benefits such as glucose, insulin-dependent and insulin-independent glucose-mediated disposal, looking at just sort of mitochondrial function, mitochondrial health, density, and then looking at sort of the sort of neurotropic factors, the BDNF secretion that can come from this type of activity. I mean, all of these things were just pointing towards this was a glaring hole in my training that I needed to get back. And so that has been great. And like you said, I mean, one of the things about zone 2 that I really enjoy is it's just not that hard. You know, like, frankly, sometimes it's just nice to get on the bike. And I probably spend 3 or 4 hours a week doing it. And that is my time to listen to podcasts and audiobooks. And I really enjoy it. I can't wait to get on that bike. As sort of boring as it seems to be sitting on a stationary bike for that long, there's never been a day when I've been like, I don't feel like doing this. I always look forward to it. And I think in large part, it's because I also get to combine it with learning, which you wouldn't be doing if you're out there crushing intervals. And not that there's something wrong with that. I think each of these things has this time and a place, but I think that we can do Zone 2 our entire lives. We can do it safely, and it just yields enormous dividends.
What's nice about that too, for I think a lot of your training, is you've got the smart erg, so you can tie yourself to the mast, that the output, whether you pedal faster, it's going to give you the output that you pre-desired. So you can't start cheating, which is what I find myself doing when I don't have it on smart, just the erg, that I find myself pedaling faster, just unconsciously, just wanting to push myself harder. But
do you use a Wahoo Kicker? What's your device? Are you on a Wahoo Kicker?
Yeah, Wahoo Kicker. So you can set it to either smart or set it at a certain level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love my Wahoo Kicker.
Yeah, me too.
Did you ever have a CompuTrainer back in the day?
I did. Yeah. I had it on an old Windows computer. I remember that. I had the little CompuTrainer, and then it's connected to the bike trainer. Yeah. Tried simulating the Tour de France one year, just in terms of the time.
Yeah.
So talk about the time over summer. I had a bucket. My wife now, I can't believe she's my wife now. I was living in Las Vegas, and it was the middle of I would sit in our apartment with a bike trainer and had a bucket with ice of water bottles and things like that. And eggs. I would think I was doing a ketogenic diet, so I was eating eggs at the time, but I don't know if that was stillness. I wasn't going anywhere. It was stationary biking. So on this topic, moving along, the importance of deadlifts as an adult. How has your thinking changed on this? I like your history on this one, so maybe even take it back to in school when you were doing powerlifting before it might have been in vogue.
Yeah, long before it was in vogue. One of my best friends in high school, who was also involved in boxing and martial arts, we would go to the Scarborough campus of the University of Toronto every day and lift weights. And it's still one of the fondest memories I have of what a gym could be like. It would certainly be it was certainly not the sunny, warm Golds in Venice, but it had some of those features, which was old school, lots of iron, nothing fancy. Of course, unlike a nice gym, this was like 2 stories below ground, so there were no windows, poorly ventilated. So in the summer, it was staggeringly hot. In the winter, it was so cold, you felt like you were getting frostbitten by touching the iron. And aside from me and my friend, there were no kids there. We were 14, 15, 16 years old. And it was this group of men who, to this day, I think back and like can't believe how strong they were. And most of them competed in powerlifting. And so that sort of got us interested in powerlifting. And that's how we sort of started putzing around with it. And as most people know who are listening, or I guess people who might know who are listening, powerlifting is different from Olympic lifting. Powerlifting is 3 lifts: the deadlift, the squat, and the bench press. And so, yeah, make a long story short, grew up doing a lot of deadlifting, a lot of squatting, a lot of bench pressing. Was always very horrible at bench press, much better at squatting and deadlifting. Fast forward to, I don't know, a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I had an injury where I kind of tore or partially tore one of my obliques. I don't even remember how I did it. I remember it was very stupid, whatever I did. And everything
Tearing a phone book?
That would be great.
Possible.
But everything went kind of sideways after that. And I really was never able to fully deadlift again without some discomfort. And so, again, this is now take it back to maybe 2016. I sort of decided, you know what, maybe the deadlift has reached its point of futility, and maybe I've extracted all I'm going to out of that. And there's no denying what a wonderful movement it is in terms of being a total hip hinge compound movement. But I was like, look, I could probably get most of the benefits of a deadlift doing things that place me under less load. And also, again, in the spirit of thinking about longevity, I thought, why does one need to subject themselves to twice their body weight or more in an axial load? So I sort of got away from it. And then I think all that kind of changed when I started DNS, Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization, which I started about 18 months ago. And we're going to have a podcast on this topic because it's just, there's so much I want to talk about here. And so actually, I think today we got an email about how we're trying to make some time for this podcast. So we'll definitely, if you're listening to this and you don't know what DNS is, Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization, by all means, you should go read about it. But we're going to have at least one solid podcast on this. But it was through that process that I realized actually the deadlift for me was going to be beneficial, not because of the metabolic benefits. I was not going to be doing Tabata deadlifts like I used to, or even by trying to set records for how much I could lift or anything like that, but rather because it becomes a beautiful audit for everything working perfectly. So I deadlifted this morning. So today's a Monday. I deadlifted on Saturday. I deadlifted a few days before that. Like I deadlift at least twice a week, often 3 times a week, both straight bar and trap bar. And Bob, I don't go that heavy. I don't know the last time, maybe I've had 400 pounds on one of those on the trap bar in the past year, but I usually sort of stop at about 350 to 375. On the straight bar, I'm even lighter, maybe 185. I do a lot of slow eccentrics. I film every single rep of every single set, and I study it, and I send it to Beth Lewis, who is my coach. And we do so much around making this deadlift perfect. And I'd rather take a light weight and deadlift it perfectly several times a week. And I'm not doing like killing crusher sets. Like, I mean, today was 4 sets of 10, 5 sets of 10 maybe. And at no point was I like past my limit. So again, I can push myself harder doing other things. But what I could get out of doing that deadlift perfectly is, do I have just the right amount of thoracic extension? Do I have just the right curvature in the lumbar spine? Am I activating my glutes? Am I activating my hamstrings? Am I pulling back instead of pulling up? Am I wedging correctly? Like all of this little stuff translates biomechanically to the activities of daily living that matter to me, like getting up off the floor, picking up one of my kids, lifting a piece of luggage or something like that. And so if I can do the deadlift and it feels right, then I know I'm ready to do everything correctly. And when I'm deadlifting and I feel like, hey, this isn't correct, this doesn't feel right, well, first of all, now I've really learned what that feeling is. And secondly, I've now learned the steps that I can go back and reconstruct what needs to be done. And so one of the things I definitely want to do at some point in the next year is actually put together kind of a video on deadlift and deadlift preparation, because I think that there are probably 10 exercises that I do as a way to get ready to deadlift, and they don't take long. Like this, my deadlift checklist is like 10 to 15 minutes, so it's not so onerous. It's almost like ketosis, the way we were talking about it in the past, right? Which is, it's not even clear if it's the ketones themselves that can sometimes be the benefit versus the metabolic conditions that allow you to make them, right? In other words, I'm not even sure how much of the benefit is the actual deadlift versus all the things you have to do the deadlift correctly. And one of the most exciting things, just on this, the last thing I say on this, is it never occurred to me up until a year and a half ago that you could actually deadlift in a way that puts your spine under traction. That's very counterintuitive. You would think that anytime you're lifting under an axial load, your spine is under compression. But it turns out when you learn the right positioning and you understand how to create intra-abdominal pressure and you know how to elongate your spine, you can actually deadlift and create traction in the spine actively. And that's why deadlifting is the most important thing I do before I get on an airplane. Because when you're on an airplane and you're sitting there for 5 or 6 hours, what you really want to do is not let your spine be compressed. And the deadlift primes me to then go and sort of maintain that activated form of traction.
Yeah, it's a significant investment, but I would say it's worth it that you'll bring your hex bar to the gate before your flight and pump yourself up and bang out a few sets.
I mean, I don't know what it is about the TSA guys. They get so wigged out when you have your hex bar there at the gate.
Putting that overhead?
Yeah. If you're TSA pre, they don't mind as much. But if you're not TSA pre, they just lose it.
Sticklers. They're sticklers. Yeah. separate topic, a little lighter, maybe. Have you read any good books lately?
I am about a third of the way through Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree. Have you read that?
No, I have not.
It's super interesting. It's a long book, so yeah, it's going to take a while. But I've actually thought it would be probably really interesting to have Andrew on the podcast. He's obviously just one of those guys that when you're in the process of writing a book, you probably shouldn't be reading their books because they just make you not want to write yours anymore because you're so bad. You're like, ugh, how does he do it? It's like Sid Mukherjee, it's just one of these people who are just so exceptional in their ability to write. Not a word is wasted. Everything is just perfect. So prior to that, I reread Stillness is the Key for the third time. I know we interviewed Ryan a few months ago. That is a book that has just spoken to me probably more than anything else Ryan has written. And he's written some really great books in that series. And just overall, the other two books in that series, Ego is the Enemy, which I'm also a huge fan of, and The Obstacle is the Way. But Stillness is really the one that kind of captivates me. And that's why I've just finished it for a third time. I've also gifted that book probably half a dozen times. And so, yeah, I suspect there'll be at least a fourth reading of that book in my future. What about you?
Good question. So I was thinking in the context of the podcast, and there's so many books, I guess it's not recently, but for the guests, just reading a lot of their books it's great. It's a pleasure. I actually think of Gary Taubes and how you read Why We Get Fat, and you had a list of questions and you asked him all those questions. There's a version of that where I get to read these books and I have a list of questions and I'll ask you to ask the questions or ping them off of you. So actually what I'm reading right now, it's not out yet, but it's really interesting, which is Vinay Prasad, who probably be right around the time of this episode, I guess, or no, we recorded around that time. And he has a book called Malignant, which is really interesting. It gets into public health policy and cancer. It's funny about the books that you reread. There's like a Taleb quote. It's funny. He's now like I would say Einstein or Lincoln, but you attribute all these kind of quotes to him. He has a lot of aphorisms. Is it better to read 5 books or to read one book 5 times? I think it depends on the quality of the book. Azra Raza is another guest on the podcast. Hasn't come up yet. But
that's right.
The First Cell.
We'll be talking with her very soon. That looks like a great book.
I'm waiting. When you had Sid Mukherjee on too, he talked about a PBS that they're going to do a follow-up, which is not a book, but for that podcast, I went back and I read The Gene and The Emperor of All Maladies and The 3 Laws, which is I guess it's a TED book. It's almost like a TED Talk in a book. And that is really, really interesting. And you went into each law in depth there. My thing is I usually go in the sauna about an hour a day, and I either print out a stack of papers that I want to read for research or just read a book in there. So I should probably just put these down in a spreadsheet and see what I'm accumulating as far as reading. But a bunch of it has been on the podcast prep. I also read that Stillness is the Key, which I found that's definitely worth reading again. I've got a bunch of others, but we'll move on. Baby aspirin and the use for prevention of blood clots or thrombosis during a flight.
Yeah, so I used to be of the mindset that anybody who was on a long enough flight should be taking a baby aspirin for prevention of deep vein thromboses. And I just sort of assumed that was the case. I mean, it's widely understood that baby aspirin or aspirin in general inhibits platelets, and platelets, of course, are one of the cellular matters in blood that's responsible for clotting. So it just struck me as sort of reasonable. And then, I don't know, again, maybe about a year and a half ago, kind of did a little digging into this and found that there really wasn't much evidence that aspirin or baby aspirin had any efficacy in mitigation of deep vein thromboses, especially on an airplane. And in digging around, we sort of found that, well, the gold standard would, of course, be heparin, which could either be fractionated or ultra low molecular weight heparin, but these are not very practical. I mean, intravenous heparin is obviously not something you're going to do before a flight, and even the low molecular weight heparins have to be injected. So we found a couple of supplements online. One was called Flight Tab, I think. I think it was FLITE Tab. At the time, you could buy it on Amazon. I haven't looked in a while to see if it's still there. But it was a pretty potent agent that actually had pretty remarkable evidence that it prevented DVT. And then the other is something that is also pretty easy to get over the counter called nattokinase. And I think that the natto is a plant. It's plant derived. I think it actually it's like sort of stinky odor is sort of the types of foods that it occurs in naturally, or certain types of mushrooms or, cheeses or things like that. But these are things that actually turned out to have far more evidence. And they were both things I'd never heard of until we sort of really dug into this question. So that was a bit of a humbling experience, because you think, well, look, on first principles, aspirin's got to be thinning the blood. It's got to be good for this. And then you realize, well, wait a minute, even something as simple as that, when you actually really antagonize the literature, it turned out not to be the case. And the things that did seem to have some efficacy are things I'd never even heard of. So it's a little scary, because it makes you wonder, how many times is that happening throughout the course of my life?
Yeah. This sounds apropos in terms of strong convictions held loosely. Your feeling on generic drugs. Obviously, Catherine Eban was a guest there. What do you think prior to that, and some of the stuff that you were seeing in, I guess, the clinic, or at least at some of your patients, and taking generics?
Yeah, Catherine's podcast it would be hard to say that hasn't been one of the 10 most important podcasts that we've done in this first 100. If you haven't listened to that, I suggest you just hit pause on this now and go back and listen to it. What number was it? Do you know? You can search EBAN, EBAN, in your podcast player and it'll show up. But I think prior to that, my view had always been generics are great. They're the exact same as branded, except they're a fraction of the cost, and branded drugs are a scam. That was sort of my default thinking all through medical school. I'd say in the last couple of years, I began to wonder if maybe there were a couple generics that weren't great, because in the case of certain drugs where you do have a very clear biomarker for use, such as a statin, you put a patient on Crestor, but of course they don't get Crestor, they get rosuvastatin, and you look at their blood level 2 months later and there's no change in anything that you would expect to see a change in. And when you query them, they tell you they've taken it every day, and you believe them because there's nothing they need to lie. They can easily say, oh, I forgot, if they did. You see a couple of those things and you start to wonder if maybe not all generics are created equal. But then, of course, in the discussion with Catherine, I came away thinking, oh boy, this is a totally different way of doing things. And it's completely changed the way we do things in the practice now. So we work primarily with one pharmacy that will either at our insistence or the patient's insistence only issue branded drugs, sometimes even when it is a little bit costly. And when we do generics, we do it through the lens of looking at the companies specifically that make them, and at least taking a first order pass at cross-referencing that with sort of an FDA list of potential bad actors. So I don't think that has completely mitigated the problem, but I think it's probably taken care of 3/4 of it.
Another one, this one is omega-3 fatty acids. Your thoughts on that? And obviously Bill Harris is somebody who came on the podcast recently. So Catherine Eban was number 71, that was in September of last year. And Bill Harris was in December of last year, and he came on and talked about omega-3 fatty acids. So what's your take on omega-3 and how's it changed?
This is funny. I think I'm still sort of in my evolution on this. I think I've for a long time held the view. Longly, is that even a word? Did I just make that up? I've longly held the view. I have for a long time held the view that EPA and DHA are beneficial. Obviously had some questions as to, again, how much of it was the other things that you got when you ate things that were high in EPA and DHA versus just the supplemental thing. I would say that my thinking has evolved to the point where EPA and DHA by themselves are quite potent drugs. We really ought to think of them in that way. So that, in fact, you look at a drug like Vasepa, which is just pharmaceutical grade EPA at the tune of 4 grams. That is as potent as any anti-cardiovascular disease drug that we have. So clearly EPA has a benefit to it, especially in patients that are at risk for cardiovascular disease. I think with DHA, the clinical trials data are still not clear. There's a pretty interesting setback on a clinical trial in the fall that was looking at a combination of EPA, DHA, and it was a trial that was stopped for futility. So there was no harm from it, but there wasn't the big bang benefit that we frankly expected to see based on the earlier trial with Vasepa, which was just EPA. I think the discussion with Bill Harris certainly increased my level of confidence in the necessity of EPA and DHA, and also probably drove me to a point of thinking about it being a higher level that we should strive for. We used to generally look at an RBC or red blood cell membrane level of about 8% to 10%, but I think I came away from the discussion with Bill Harris thinking we could really push that up to 12, 14% without undesirable side effects, and also getting more value or more benefit from it. I think one area that Bill had a very strong conviction on that I've kind of had the opposite conviction too. So I think I'm still in the space of wanting to learn this. So I think my strong conviction had generally been that excessive amounts of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, were generally not a good thing. And the associative data there is not hard to understand. But again, the problem with the associative data is things that are full of omega-6 PUFAs are often crap. So it's easy to see an association with high omega-6 polyunsaturated fat and disease, chronic disease. But Bill's point was that the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats aren't harmful. It's just that diets that are rich in them tend to be void in EPA and DHA. So his real takeaway was, don't think about omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. You just need to add more EPA and DHA in. That's the issue. And so I think you and I have been talking about this actually over the past couple of weeks, but I think I'd really like to go back and do a podcast that looks specifically at the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid discussion and really kind of dive into the whole PUFA literature from an omega-6 standpoint. Because again, this is a very polarizing topic. People just on both sides of this. Both sides, I think, have people that I think are quite bright. So I'm a bit confused on that. And for me, it's not really a huge issue personally because I just don't gravitate towards those oils. Like I find them to be kind of gross. And I don't know why you'd want to consume, like it wouldn't occur to me to put canola oil on a salad when I could put olive oil on or something like that. So on a personal level, I think the point is somewhat moot because N6 PUFA don't make up much of my diet, but I do think it has huge implications for public health. And I think it has implications for our patients when we think about people who are potentially eating a lot of PUFA.
Okay. One question here. One theme in recent episodes, not overly related to medicine, has been the idea of saying no. I think of Jason Fried, Rick Elias, actually probably Jason Fried twice, have talked about this thing and how you viewed this sort of in the past and now today, this idea of saying no, how good you are at it, when do you think it's applicable, and if you've improved on this.
I've definitely improved on it in the sense that there was a day when I couldn't say no or wouldn't say no to anything or anyone. The pendulum was pretty far off on one side where I was basically on a treadmill of sort of saying yes to anything and everything that was asked of me. Began to realize that I just couldn't do that anymore. And I'm getting a lot better at saying no. And I don't think I'm doing it at a level that's unhealthy either. I mean, you can obviously take these things to far extremes on both sides, and you could sort of say no to everything and become sort of dysfunctional in that way. It's hard to do. It is hard to do. And I remember there was a podcast that there was someone that Tim Ferriss had on his podcast. God, I want to say like a year and a half ago. I forget the name of the person, but hopefully we'll find it for the show notes. It was a really good episode on saying no. And I remember that was actually the first time I started really contemplating it. And I remember shortly after listening to it, I had someone who I really liked, respected, called me and said, "Hey, I really like you to be on the board of such and such." And I mean, deep down, I knew it was going to be a pain in the ass. I knew it was just going to be so much work. And even just the travel of getting to the board meetings wasn't in a place where there was easy access and all these other things. And I remember thinking, I just got to do this. I just got to do this. And I remembered one of the lessons in that podcast was don't answer, just say, "Can I get back to you?" So I pulled "Can I get back to you on this?" And then with the benefit of a little bit of distance, I realized, Peter, you're crazy. You can't possibly do this thing. You already lament the time you don't get to spend at home. So then the next day I just called him back and said, hey, I can't do this. I'm sorry, but here's why. And just like this person in the podcast with Tim said, the guy understood. It wasn't like I'd committed some grievous, heinous crime in declining this. So I think that's just an important thing to remember. And yeah, I continue to look forward to refining my no saying skills.
It's interesting. I think it's always hard for ourselves to do it. But then when you think in the context of how you work and operate with other people or decision making, you'll very easily say no. If it's whether it's like having more patience in the practice, if it's not going to benefit what you have going on, then you're usually very matter of fact. But I think it's almost like it might be like the ego getting in the way or something where you want to tackle everything. I mean, I think this is probably a little cathartic, but it's getting into some of this research where you'll have to tell me no as far as the deep dives and the rabbit holes that I want to go down, where I say like, we're on a mission. I don't even want to give the milk analogy, but for a lot of these episodes and a lot of the guests, a little bit of the deep diving can help, but oftentimes it's really about the stuff that you say no to helps shape the things that you actually are focusing on day to day that matter.
Yeah, that's the insight that I think Jason Fried brought to his episode really well, which was when you're saying yes to something, you're actually saying no to something else. You just don't know what that something else is yet. That's a very important insight. And again, anybody who struggles with saying no, I think would benefit greatly from actually both episodes with Jason, because I think we touch on them in both.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I think of Tim Ferriss just himself talking about saying no and his evolution. He's probably done his own podcast talking about that. And I always think of, I do a lot of reading on Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett. But if you look at their schedules, they're like practically empty. I think Munger refers to himself as like a book with legs, that all he does is he just reads, and that's how he gets smarter. And so he jealously guards his time. You would look at the schedule and you'd say, oh, it's wide open. It looks like, if you're the secretary and say, yeah, it looks like the schedule's wide open. Nope. It's more about saying no and what that schedule can be open to if you have all those vacancies there.
Yeah, I have great envy for that. And I hope to one day get to that point where my calendar doesn't look like it does now. And it's much more last minute things that are being scheduled where you can actually say like, hey, do I want to have this meeting tomorrow as opposed to do I want to have this meeting in 3 months?
So I think maybe one more question if you want to take it. I know this one is difficult because it's like, what is the thing? It's like asking you like which of your children is your favorite? But as far as the episodes go, do any of them stand out in your mind? Maybe even just like the style or the way it's happened, or separate question as far as just doing a podcast, hosting a podcast and interviewing people and having conversations. Are there things like going into this that you thought, I mean, part of it was like you never wanted to do a podcast. And now I think that you might have a different opinion about that. So how about that strong opinion, maybe a little more loosely held today as far as doing a podcast?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the first time the idea of a podcast was floated to me was about 2014. And I mean, it was the worst idea I ever heard. And it was mostly due to a fear of the amount of work that would go into it. Because at the time, I knew a few people who were doing podcasts, and it was sort of the only thing they did. It was like, well, that's a non-starter. I just don't have the time to do something where it's the only thing I'm doing. So it's just not going to happen. And I sort of kind of kept that point of view, frankly, until about 2 years ago when or maybe a little less than 2 years ago, actually, when we decided to give it a try. So yeah, that was a very strongly held or strong conviction, fortunately loosely enough held that I was able to sort of get out of my own way on that. And yeah, I really can say that I have enjoyed it a lot. It is hard. It is a little more work than I thought, but also we have such a big team that works on it that I have it easier than probably a lot of people who do a podcast, in that I have a great research team. We have 2 people that work exclusively on the podcast, in Travis and Nick. So all the heavy lifting of making show notes and things like that, none of that falls on my shoulders. So all I really have to think about is having discussions with people and trying to think of topics that I want to meet people who can speak to those topics. So I've loved it. And it's hard to believe we're at 100, because you sort of realize there's not that many podcasts that sort of get into the territory of multiple hundreds of episodes. And I mean, barring some unforeseen thing, we're going to one day be that podcast that's on our 300th episode or something crazy. Now, to your first question, honestly, I've thought about this a lot, and I get asked this question a lot, Bob, which is, what is my favorite episode? And it's so hard because they are so different. There are some that I've really enjoyed from a technical standpoint. I think the Rick Johnson podcast and the Keith Flaherty podcast really stand out to me as podcasts that I have gone back and listened to several times because of the technical content in them. So there are probably half a dozen that are like that for me, where they're just so much interesting information that I can't wait to go back and listen to them again, which I don't listen to most of the podcasts. I think on the other side of the coin, there are experiences for me, like interviewing Damon Hill was just unbelievable. And just to have him be so open and so just available to talk through his own difficulties and obviously everything that went into his career and beforehand, that was a really special episode for me as just a fan of his and such a fan of F1 and obviously a fan of Senna, who was his teammate when he died. I thought the Rick Elias podcast really, even though I knew Rick really well and there was nothing we talked about that I didn't know, but as it was unfolding and we were having the discussion, I remember thinking, you know what? I think a lot of people are going to really benefit from this episode. I know I was. And then we've already touched on some, but you look at the Catherine Eban podcast, which is just an unbelievable opportunity to, I think, help people with information, which is also kind of part of the itch that we're trying to scratch here. So the irony of it is, if I sat here long enough, Bob, I could tell you something special about all 99 that came before this, with the exception of the AMAs. I could probably rattle off something special about 80 of these podcasts through the lens of one or more filter.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Tom Brady into the podcast. I mean, it's probably a record as far as how long I've waited. I think he's often asked the question, what's his favorite Super Bowl ring? And he says, the next one. So I think maybe you think about that with the episodes. What's your favorite episode? Might be the next one. For me, I mean, that's how it is for me. I like reflecting on these episodes, but the research that goes into these guests, and I think we just have a lot of similarities as far as our interests. So for you, to be creating the podcast that you would want to listen to, having Z-Dog, who's your buddy Stanford, from Z-Dog to Marty, and is it Macari? Macari. I usually say Macari. To Mark Messier, to say, like, why hasn't somebody sat down for a multiple hour podcast with Mark Messier and just talk about the Oilers, one of the greatest teams, if not, I'm sure you would say maybe the greatest team ever in any sport. I mean, that stuff to me is so cool. Yeah, I think about it that way, that it's similar. I could talk about each one of them and how great they are, but I'm hopefully looking forward to the ones that come too.
Well, I mean, I am as well. I think I know we're getting better at this. And I remember I think I may have even mentioned this once before on a podcast, whether it was ours or someone else's, that I had this little tiny fear when we started that we were going to run out of things to talk about and run out of people to interview. And I was sort of reluctant to start this thing and then realize, well, after 50 episodes, there's nothing left to do. And I think you can attest to the fact that our list of people we want to have on is growing at the same rate as our AMA list of questions. Like, we can't interview people quick enough at the rate that we want to learn stuff. So I have a feeling we're going to be able to do this for a very long time. And I do look forward to getting better at it. It is a craft and it's hard. I do try to listen to some of the podcasts to learn from them. And I've certainly picked up a number of things I could be doing better. And as I think I talked about on Tim's podcast, I enjoy listening to other really good podcasts for some insight into how to do this thing better. But anyway, I'm excited about it, and it's hard to imagine what the next 100 have to hold, actually.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it. I think maybe we cheers, have some champagne, or you can wrestle a centenarian to commemorate the moment. I'm sure that's what you probably have that on your schedule anyway.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of centenarian boxing this afternoon, so.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, this was a good idea. I don't know if it was your idea or Nick's idea, but maybe both of you guys deserve credit for this. But I think this was a fun way to commemorate 100, kind of looking back and looking forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Drive. If you're interested in diving deeper into any topics we discuss, we've created a membership program that allows us to bring you more in-depth, exclusive content without relying on paid ads. It's our goal to ensure members get back much more than the price of the subscription. Now, to that end, Membership benefits include a bunch of things. 1, totally kick-ass comprehensive podcast show notes that detail every topic, paper, person, thing we discuss on each episode. The word on the street is nobody's show notes rival these. Monthly AMA episodes or Ask Me Anything episodes, hearing these episodes completely. Access to our private podcast feed that allows you to hear everything without having to listen to spiels like this. The Qualies, which are a super short podcast, typically less than 5 minutes, that we release every Tuesday through Friday, highlighting the best questions, topics, and tactics discussed on previous episodes of The Drive. This is a great way to catch up on previous episodes without having to go back and necessarily listen to everyone. Steep discounts on products that I believe in, but for which I'm not getting paid to endorse. And a whole bunch of other benefits that we continue to trickle in as time goes on. If you want to learn more and access these member-only benefits, you can head over to peterattiamd.com/subscribe. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the ID Peter Attia MD. You can also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast player you listen on. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peterattiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.